July 11th, 1302. Dawn breaks over the flat, marshy plains outside the walls of Kortrijk in Flanders. Morning mist clings to the ground like a funeral shroud. The air is thick with moisture, carrying the smell of wet earth and the distant tang of the Leie River. In the pre-dawn darkness, thousands of men wait in silence, their hands gripping wooden clubs, farming implements, and simple iron hooks called godendags. Good mornings in the Flemish tongue, a darkly ironic name for weapons designed to crack skulls and drag knights from their horses. These are not soldiers. They are weavers, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, peasants and townsmen who have never known formal military training, who have never stood in a proper battle line, who by all the laws of medieval warfare have no business facing what approaches from the south, because riding toward them through that same mist, their armor gleaming even in the pale light, come the flower of French chivalry. Over 1,000 knights, the most feared warriors in Christendom, men who have trained for war since childhood, whose very existence is defined by combat and glory. Each one mounted on a war horse worth more than a Flemish weaver might earn in 10 lifetimes. Each one encased in steel and mail that could turn aside arrows and blades. Each one carrying the golden spurs that mark their noble status, the physical symbol of their superiority over common men. They ride with the absolute confidence of those who have never known defeat by social inferiors. They ride to crush a rebellion of tradesmen and restore the natural order of the world. By sunset, the golden fields of Flanders will be red with the blood of nobility. Over 1,000 knights will lie dead in the mud, their precious armor stripped away, their golden spurs torn from their boots and piled in heaps as trophies. The greatest cavalry force in Europe will be shattered by men who were supposed to kneel before them. And the reverberations of this single day will echo through the medieval world, challenging every assumption about who was born to rule and who was born to serve. This is the story of the Battle of the Golden Spurs. This is the story of how the impossible became reality. To understand the slaughter that unfolded on that July morning, we must first understand the world that created it. Medieval Europe was built on a rigid social hierarchy that was considered not just natural, but divinely ordained. At the apex stood the nobility, knights, lords, princes, warrior aristocrats who claimed their right to rule through blood and the sword. Below them toiled everyone else, the merchants, craftsmen, and peasants whose labor created wealth, but who possessed no political power, no military legitimacy, no voice in the affairs of kingdoms. Flanders in the late 13th century occupied a strange position in this feudal order. Technically part of the Kingdom of France, Flanders was the most urbanized, most economically advanced region in northern Europe. Its cities, Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, Kortrijk, were centers of textile manufacturing that supplied cloth to markets across the continent. Flemish weavers created wealth on a scale that rivaled kingdoms. But wealth did not translate to power. The Count of Flanders, Guy of Dampierre, was a vassal of the French crown, and through him, French kings sought to control and tax the prosperous Flemish cities. By 1300, this arrangement had become intolerable to the urban population. King Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, demanded ever-increasing taxes and exerted ever tighter control over Flemish affairs. He treated the wealthy cities as mere sources of revenue, their prosperous burghers as peasants to be milked. The French nobility viewed Flemish merchants with undisguised contempt. These were commoners who had grown too rich, too independent, too proud. They needed to be reminded of their place. Tensions exploded in May 1302 with an event known as the Bruges Matins. On the morning of May 18th, the people of Bruges rose in coordinated violence against the French garrison occupying their city. They went door to door, seeking out French soldiers and officials, identifying them by making them speak the Flemish shibboleth Schild en Vriend, shield and friend, a phrase the French could not pronounce correctly. Those who failed the test were killed on the spot. By the end of that bloody morning, hundreds of French soldiers and officials lay dead in the streets of Bruges. The massacre was not spontaneous. It had been carefully planned by Flemish guild leaders and urban militia captains, men like Peter de Koninck, a weaver from Bruges, and Jan Bredel, a butcher. These are not nobles or trained military commanders. They were craftsmen and merchants who had organized their fellow townsmen into a fighting force driven by something the French could not understand: the belief that their prosperity, their way of life, their very survival depended on resistance. Philip IV's response was swift and predictable. He would send an army to crush this rebellion of shopkeepers and restore proper order. He assembled a force dominated by the mounted nobility of France, knights whose families had fought in the Crusades, who considered warfare their birthright and exclusive profession. Leading them was Robert II of Artois, a prince of the blood royal, grandson of King Louis IX. Robert was brave, experienced, supremely confident. He had fought campaigns before. He understood that peasants and townsmen, no matter how many, could not stand against armored cavalry. It was a truth written in the blood of countless medieval battles. What Robert did not understand, what none of the French nobility understood, was that the Flemish rebels were not planning to meet them in open battle on terms favorable to cavalry. They were planning an ambush based on terrain, preparation, and a willingness to fight with a desperation that nobles who had titles and estates to return to could never match. The Flemish chose their ground with care. Outside Kortrijk, the terrain was crossed by streams and drainage ditches, typical of the low-lying Flemish countryside. These waterways were not impressive obstacles. Many were barely 3 feet wide, but they were numerous, creating a landscape of small fields and marshy patches. The Flemish militia, under the command of experienced urban military leaders, positioned themselves with these obstacles to their front. They knew that cavalry's greatest advantage was the shock of a mass charge, horses and armored men crashing into an enemy line with unstoppable momentum. Take away the charge by breaking up the ground, and you neutralize that advantage. They also came prepared with weapons specifically designed to defeat armored cavalry. The Godendag was a uniquely Flemish weapon, a heavy wooden staff about 5 feet long, topped with an iron spike. It could be used as a club to batter armor, or as a spear to strike at riders and horses. More importantly, many Flemish fighters carried specialized hooks designed to grab onto armor or horse harnesses and pull riders from their saddles. Once a knight was on the ground, his armor became a liability. The joints and gaps could be exploited by daggers. The weight made it difficult to rise quickly, and a man flat on his back in the mud was vulnerable to the simplest of weapons, a heavy club swung with the force of desperation. But weapons and terrain alone do not explain what happened. To understand the slaughter, we must understand the psychological gulf between the two armies. The French knights rode to Kortrijk as they had ridden to 100 other battles, with absolute confidence in their superiority. They were not merely better trained or better equipped. They believed themselves to be fundamentally different in kind from the men they would face. Nobility, in their worldview, was not just a social category, but an essential quality. They were bred for war. Violence was in their blood. Peasants and merchants might outnumber them, but numbers meant nothing when God and nature had ordained that one mounted knight was worth 100 commoners. This was not mere arrogance. It was the central organizing principle of their entire society. Medieval French culture celebrated chivalry, the code of the warrior aristocrat. The literature of the age, the chansons de geste, the Arthurian romances, glorified knights as humanity's highest achievement. To be defeated by social inferiors was not just a military setback. It was a metaphysical impossibility, a violation of the cosmic order. The Flemish fought with a different psychology entirely. They were defending their homes, their livelihoods, their families. The wealth they had created through decades of labor was being squeezed by foreign overlords who contributed nothing but demands. They had already committed the ultimate transgression by slaughtering a French garrison at Bruges. There was no going back, no forgiveness. If they lost this battle, the reprisals would be terrible beyond imagining. Entire cities might be burned. Thousands would be executed. Their choice was victory or annihilation. This was not chivalric warfare, fought according to elaborate rules and customs. This was existential struggle, and men fighting for survival fight with a ferocity that men fighting for glory cannot match. As dawn gave way to morning on July 11th, the French army approached the Flemish position. Contemporary chronicles speak of the splendor of that army. The colorful heraldic banners, the polished armor catching the light, the countless lances like a forest of steel. It must have been both beautiful and terrifying, the concentrated military power of the greatest kingdom in Europe assembled to crush a revolt of commoners. Robert of Artois surveyed the Flemish lines. He saw thousands of men on foot, armed with primitive weapons, arrayed in dense formations. He saw what he expected to see, an undisciplined mob that would break and run at the first charge. His knights were eager for the attack. This would be a short fight, barely worthy of the name battle. Then would come the sacking of the rebel cities, the hangings and burnings, the restoration of proper order. The French commanders did notice the terrain, the streams and ditches that crossed the ground. Some voices urged caution, suggested that the cavalry dismount and fight on foot where the broken ground would matter less. But such suggestions were dismissed. Dismount? Fight as infantry like common soldiers? The proposal was almost insulting. They were knights. They would fight as knights fought, mounted and glorious. The charge began with trumpets and war cries. Hundreds of armored cavalry surged forward, their horses' hooves shaking the earth. The Flemish lines did not break. They did not run. They stood firm, their front ranks kneeling with their golden dags braced against the ground, creating a forest of spikes. Behind them, more ranks stood ready to strike at any rider who broke through. What happened next unfolded with horrible inevitability. The leading horses reached the first stream, nothing more than a wide ditch perhaps 3 feet across. In dry conditions, it would have been a minor obstacle, but the ground was soft from recent rains. Horses stumbled. Some refused to jump. The perfect unity of the charge fragmented as different parts of the cavalry line encountered different obstacles at different moments. By the time the first knights reached the Flemish lines, they were not arriving in one overwhelming wave but in scattered groups, their momentum broken. The Flemish did not try to receive the charge passively. They countercharged, rushing forward with their clubs and hooks. They targeted the horses, striking at legs and heads, pulling riders from their saddles. A knight on horseback was formidable. A knight on the ground, his horse dead or fled, weighed down by 60 pounds of armor in muddy terrain, was merely a target. The battle devolved into something medieval warfare was never supposed to be, a close-quarter slaughter of armored nobility by common infantry. The chronicles describe scenes of horror. Knights trapped in the mud, unable to rise, beaten to death with clubs. Nobles drowning in shallow ditches, the weight of their armor dragging them down. Riders torn from their horses by multiple Flemish fighters using hooks and ropes, then stabbed to death through the gaps in their armor. Robert of Artois himself, the prince who had been so confident that morning, was surrounded and killed. Contemporary sources say the Flemish didn't even realize they had killed a prince until after the battle when his body was identified. To them, he was just another armored figure to be dragged down and dispatched. The grandson of a saint king, a man whose family had ruled kingdoms, died in the mud at the hands of weavers and butchers. The French knights, facing this nightmare, could not comprehend what was happening. This was not how battles worked. Peasants did not defeat cavalry. The natural order was being violated before their eyes, and they did not know how to respond. Some continued to charge, disbelieving, certain that the next attack would restore normality. Others tried to flee and found that the same broken terrain that had disrupted their charge now trapped them. Horses floundered in ditches. Knights on foot in armor could not outrun their pursuers. The slaughter continued for hours. By the time the fighting ended, over 1,000 French knights lay dead on the field. Some sources put the number even higher. More than 1,000 of the most elite warriors in Christendom, each one representing decades of training and noble lineage, were killed by men who were supposed to be their natural inferiors. And then came the aftermath, the moment that would give the battle its name and its symbolic power. The Flemish victors moved across the field, stripping the dead of their armor and equipment. But they were particularly interested in one item, the golden spurs that each knight wore, the symbol of their knightly status. Spurs were not merely functional items. They were ceremonial objects, granted in the ritual of knighthood, marking the wearer as a member of the warrior elite. To possess golden spurs was to possess proof of no. The Flemish collected these spurs methodically, hundreds upon hundreds of them, torn from the boots of the dead. Contemporary accounts speak of them being gathered in heaps, piled in wagons, displayed in the churches of the victorious cities. Some sources claim they collected over 700 pairs, though the exact number is lost to history. The symbolic message was clear. The markers of noble superiority had been torn from the bodies of the defeated and claimed as trophies by commoners. The natural order had not just been violated, it had been inverted. The spurs were more than mere plunder. They were proof of an impossible victory, physical evidence that the assumptions underlying medieval society could be challenged. They were hung in churches, not as war trophies in the traditional sense, but as almost sacred objects, symbols of liberation. The people of Flanders had not just won a battle. They had struck a blow against the very structure of feudal hierarchy. News of the battle spread across Europe with the speed of wildfire. Its impact was seismic. In an age where news traveled slowly and reliable information was rare, the Battle of the Golden Spurs became instantly legendary. Chronicles and letters carried the story to every kingdom and principality, often with shocked disbelief. It cannot be true. It must be exaggerated. But the evidence was undeniable. The flower of French chivalry had been destroyed by urban militia. The psychological impact on the nobility was profound. For generations, the entire social structure had rested on the assumption that military power and political authority naturally belonged to the warrior aristocracy. A knight on horseback was not just militarily superior to a commoner. He was cosmically superior, ordained by God and nature to rule. The Battle of the Golden Spurs shattered that assumption. If peasants and craftsmen could defeat knights, then what justified noble rule? If common militia could triumph over chivalric cavalry, then what was the source of aristocratic authority? The battle forced military thinkers to reconsider fundamental assumptions about warfare. The Flemish had demonstrated that infantry, properly organized and fighting on favorable terrain, could defeat cavalry. This was not entirely unprecedented. There had been other instances of infantry victories, but the scale and completeness of the Flemish triumph was unprecedented. It suggested that the dominance of the mounted knight, which had defined European warfare for centuries, was not inevitable or permanent. The battle also revealed the military potential of urban populations. Medieval warfare had been dominated by the feudal levy, armies raised from the lands of nobles, composed primarily of armored cavalry and their retainers. Cities were sources of wealth to be taxed, not military power. But the Flemish had shown that prosperous urban centers could field effective military forces, organized around craft guilds and urban militias, motivated by the defense of their economic interests and political freedoms. For the French crown, Kortrijk was a humiliation that demanded response. Philip IV could not allow such a defeat to stand unanswered. But the revenge, when it came, was neither swift nor complete. The French did eventually defeat Flemish forces in later battles, reasserting royal authority. But they could never fully undo what Kortrijk had demonstrated. The golden spurs remained in Flemish churches, physical proof that the impossible had happened. For Flanders itself, the victory became the foundation of cultural identity. The Battle of the Golden Spurs entered Flemish memory as a defining moment, proof that their ancestors had fought for freedom against overwhelming odds and won. Even today, July 11th is celebrated in Flanders as the Day of the Flemish Community, the region's official holiday. The Golden Spurs remain the central symbol, representing resistance to foreign domination and the assertion of local identity against imperial power. But the significance of Kortrijk extends beyond Flemish nationalism or military history. The battle represented something unprecedented in medieval Europe, the successful assertion of urban, commercial interests against feudal military power. The men who won at Kortrijk were not fighting for abstract ideals or dynastic claims. They were fighting for the right to govern their own cities, to control their own economic destinies, to resist the endless taxation and interference of distant overlords. In this sense, Kortrijk was an early chapter in a much longer story. The centuries-long struggle between feudal hierarchy and urban independence, between the power of the sword and the power of commerce, between inherited authority and earned prosperity. The Flemish victory did not end that struggle. The forces of feudal monarchy would remain dominant for centuries more. But Kortrijk proved that those forces were not invincible, that there were alternative forms of social organization that could compete militarily and politically with the warrior aristocracy. The golden spurs themselves became a powerful symbol precisely because they inverted the normal flow of authority. In the medieval world, symbols of status flowed downward from kings to nobles to knights to commoners. Kings granted titles, lords granted lands, knights granted protection. But at Kortrijk, the flow reversed. Commoners took the symbols of noble status by force and refused to give them back. The spurs in the churches of Flanders declared that authority could be seized from below, that those who created wealth might claim political power, that birth and blood were not the only sources of legitimacy. We must be careful not to overstate the democratic implications of the battle. The Flemish militia was not composed of the poorest peasants, but of relatively prosperous craftsmen and merchants. The guild leaders who organized the resistance were wealthy men by the standards of their time. This was not a revolution of the truly dispossessed, but rather the assertion of urban commercial elites against feudal military elites. The Flemish did not seek to abolish hierarchy or establish equality. They wanted autonomy for their cities and recognition of their economic power. Nevertheless, within the constraints of medieval thought, Kortrijk was radical. It demonstrated that military effectiveness and political legitimacy need not rest solely with the traditional warrior aristocracy. It showed that wealth created through commerce and craft could generate the resources and organization necessary to challenge feudal authority. And it proved, most importantly, that common people fighting for their immediate material interests could defeat nobles fighting for honor and glory. The military lessons of Kortrijk were absorbed slowly and incompletely by medieval commanders. Infantry would continue to gain importance in the wars of the 14th and 15th centuries. The English longbowmen at Crécy and Agincourt, the Swiss pike formations, the Hussite war wagons, all represented different solutions to the problem of defeating armored cavalry with infantry forces. But cavalry remained central to military thinking for centuries more. The social prestige of mounted combat was too deeply embedded in aristocratic culture to be easily displaced by mere military effectiveness. Yet something had changed. After Kortrijk, there was always a doubt, a question at the back of the mind. Could it happen again? Could knights be defeated by commoners? The answer, as subsequent battles would prove, was yes. Not always, not easily, but yes. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the mounted warrior aristocracy had been punctured. And once punctured, it could never be fully restored. There is a deeper lesson here about the nature of authority and legitimacy. For centuries, European nobility had justified their power through a circular argument. They ruled because they were warriors, and they were warriors because they ruled. Their military function and their political authority were two sides of the same coin, mutually reinforcing. But Kortrijk broke that circle. It demonstrated that military function could be separated from hereditary status, that effectiveness in war could be achieved by those who had no claim to noble birth. This separation would take centuries to complete. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars would ultimately create the modern concept of the citizen soldier, the idea that military service and sacrifice were duties and rights of all citizens, not the exclusive province of a warrior caste. But the roots of that idea can be traced back to places like the fields outside Kortrijk, where craftsmen and merchants discovered that they could fight and win. The golden spurs hanging in Flemish churches represented more than a military trophy. They were proof of a possibility. They showed that the hierarchies that seemed natural and eternal were actually contingent and contestable. They demonstrated that those at the bottom of the social order need not accept their position as inevitable or divinely ordained. They proved that resistance, under the right circumstances, with the right preparation and determination, could succeed. This is why the Battle of the Golden Spurs resonates beyond its immediate historical context. It speaks to something universal in the human experience, the struggle against domination, the assertion of dignity by those denied it, the discovery that the powerful are not invincible. Every society creates hierarchies that present themselves as natural and permanent. Every age produces authorities that claim their position is justified by inherent superiority. And every age produces those who challenge such claims, who insist that authority must be earned, not inherited, who fight for the radical proposition that common people might govern themselves. The Flemish militia who stood in the marshy fields outside Kortrijk on that July morning in 1302 did not think of themselves as revolutionaries or democrats. They thought of themselves as defending their homes and livelihoods against foreign oppression. They fought with the weapons they had, crude clubs and hooks against the finest armor in Europe, because they had no choice. They organized themselves as best they could, using the structures of their guilds and militias because no one else would organize them. They won because they chose their ground carefully, fought with desperate courage, and faced an enemy blinded by arrogance and social prejudice. But in fighting for their immediate interests, they struck a blow whose reverberations extended far beyond Flanders and far beyond their own time. They proved that the supposedly natural order could be challenged. They demonstrated that military power could rest on foundations other than noble birth. They showed that prosperity, created through labor and trade, could generate the resources and solidarity necessary for resistance. They created a symbol, those piles of golden spurs, that would inspire future generations to question authority and fight for autonomy. The French knights who rode to Kortrijk that morning expected an easy victory, another chapter in the endless story of noble martial superiority. Instead, they found death in the mud at the hands of men they had dismissed as beneath notice. Their golden spurs, torn from their boots as they lay dead, became the markers of an impossible triumph, proof that history does not always flow in the directions the powerful expect. In the end, the Battle of the Golden Spurs teaches us that the hierarchies we take for granted, the assumptions about who is strong and who is weak, who rules and who serves, are more fragile than they appear. They persist not because they are natural or inevitable, but because they are enforced and accepted. And when enforcement fails and acceptance ends, they can collapse with shocking speed. The spurs hanging in the churches of Flanders were more than medieval relics. They were reminders that the impossible sometimes happens, that the supposedly weak sometimes triumph, that the symbols of power can be seized and reclaimed by those who were never meant to possess them. They were proof that on rare occasions, when conditions align and courage matches desperation, peasants can slaughter knights and take their golden spurs as trophies. And once that happens, the world can never quite return to what it was before. The golden spurs that once adorned the boots of France's finest knights now hang silent in the churches of Flanders, tarnished by 7 centuries, but undiminished in meaning. They are not merely artifacts of a distant battle. They are testimonies to a truth that every generation must learn anew, that power, no matter how overwhelming it appears, is never absolute. That courage, when coupled with conviction, can overcome impossible odds. That the hierarchies we inherit are not laws of nature, but human constructions. And what humans construct, humans can also dismantle. On that summer day in 1302, the natural order of the medieval world died in the mud outside Kortrijk. It did not die completely. Feudalism would endure for centuries more, and the nobility would continue to dominate European society. But something fundamental had changed. A possibility had been revealed. Common people, fighting for their homes and their freedom, had proven they could stand against the most fearsome warriors in Christendom and emerge victorious. The weavers and butchers who collected those spurs from the fallen did not know they were making history. They thought only of survival, of protecting the cities and families they loved, of resisting the endless demands of distant rulers who contributed nothing but took everything. They fought because they had no other choice. But in that desperate fight, they created a symbol that would outlive them by centuries, a symbol that would inspire countless others who face their own overwhelming odds. History remembers great battles for many reasons. Some are remembered for tactical brilliance, others for strategic importance, still others for the commanders who fought them. But the Battle of the Golden Spurs is remembered for something else entirely, for what it revealed about human potential, about the capacity of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things when their backs are against the wall and their cause is just. The lesson of those golden spurs is simple but profound. No tyranny is permanent. No hierarchy is unbreakable. No power is so great that it cannot be challenged. And sometimes, just sometimes, when courage meets opportunity and desperation meets determination, the impossible becomes real. 700 years have passed since that July morning. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have transformed warfare beyond recognition. The social structures of medieval Europe have long since crumbled into history. But the golden spurs remain, silent witnesses to a day when everything changed, when peasants became warriors and knights became corpses, when the symbols of authority were torn from the powerful and claimed by those who were never meant to possess them. They hang there still, in the churches of Flanders, reminding us that history does not belong only to the powerful, that victories are not predetermined by birth or wealth or military tradition, that the future is not written in stone, but forged by those brave enough to challenge what seems unchangeable. This has been another chapter from the History Files. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It lives in the symbols we preserve and the stories we tell, teaching us that what once seemed impossible might simply be waiting for those courageous enough to try. Until next time, remember, history is not just what happened. It is what we choose to learn from what happened. And the golden spurs of Kortrijk teach us that sometimes, against all odds, the meek do inherit the earth, one bloody battlefield at a time.